My dad revealed my darkest secret to make everyone laugh. I revealed his to make everyone leave. My dad, Ronnie, always thought he was the funniest man alive. He'd been doing stand-up at open mics for almost 30 years, never once getting past a 7-minute slot at bars where the audience came for cheap wings and stayed for the 2-drink minimum. But he called himself a professional comedian. He had business cards. He had a stage name he never used because nobody ever booked him. His whole personality was being the guy who made the room laugh, and it didn't matter who he had to burn to do it. If throwing a person under the bus got him 3 seconds of a chuckle from a stranger, that person was getting thrown, and most of the time, that person was me. Growing up, everything I ever did wrong turned into material. Not private material either. He'd try it out on the neighbors, then the mailman, then whatever crowd he could corner at whatever bar would still let him grab the mic. When I wet the bed until I was 9, that became a bit he did for years. He'd act it out, the waking up, the checking the sheets, the walk of shame to the laundry, and he'd do a little voice for me, this whiny cartoon voice that sounded nothing like me, but got a laugh because it was pathetic. When I threw up on stage during the 3rd grade holiday play because I was so nervous my hands were shaking, he told that story at every family gathering for a decade. He'd do the sound effect. People would groan and then laugh, and he'd point at me across the room like I was the punchline standing there in the flesh. There was no moment that belonged to me. If I got hurt, it was a bit. If I cried, it was a bit. If I got dumped, if I failed a test, if I said something dumb, it all went into the act. And the worst part was that he never asked. He never once looked at me and said, "Hey, do you mind if I tell people about this?" He just took it. He took everything. The way he took everything else in that apartment, my allowance, my privacy, the last of whatever was in the fridge, and turned it into fuel for the one thing he actually cared about, which was standing in front of strangers and being told he was funny. I want to give you a few of them, because I think you need the pile before you can understand the weight. When I was 7, I got so scared during a thunderstorm that I climbed into the bathtub and pulled the curtain shut and stayed there for hours. And instead of coming to get me, he came to the bathroom door and started narrating it in a play-by-play voice like a nature documentary, laughing, calling out to the empty apartment that the boy had gone into hiding. Folks, the boy has gone to ground. He did that bit at open mics for a year. The scared kid in the tub. I sat in the audience once, 12 years old, and watched 15 strangers laugh at the worst night of my 7-year-old life. And I laughed too, because if I didn't laugh, he'd point me out and make it worse. When I was 10, I stuttered for about 8 months after a bad year, and he built a whole routine around it. He'd do an impression of me trying to order at a drive-thru, dragging the sounds out, stretching them. And the crueler part was he did it to my face at dinner, every night, warming up the material. And he told me it was affection, that this was how men in our family showed love, by busting on each other, and that if I couldn't take it, I was going to have a hard life. When I was 13, I made the mistake of crying at a dog movie in a theater, and he told the story of the boy who cried at the dog movie for so many years that I stopped being able to cry at all, at anything, which is a thing I only figured out much later, in a room with a therapist, at great expense. He kept a little notebook. That's what I want you to understand. He carried a little spiral notebook in his back pocket his whole life, and every time something happened to me, I could see him reach back and pull it out and write it down, right in front of me, right in the moment. While I was still bleeding or crying or humiliated, he was already turning it into 3 lines he could try out on strangers. I grew up watching my own pain get transcribed in real time by the one person who was supposed to be catching me. That notebook was always fuller than the fridge. But the worst thing he ever did, the thing this whole story is really about, happened at my engagement party. I need you to understand the shape of that night before I tell you what I did back. Because if you don't understand the shape of it, you're going to think I went too far. Maybe you'll think that anyway. I've stopped being sure. I'd been with Claire for 4 years. She was the first person in my life who ever made me feel like a whole thing instead of a collection of embarrassing anecdotes. When I told her something painful, she didn't reach for a notebook. She reached for my hand. It took me 2 years to stop flinching when she did it, because I kept waiting for the pain I'd handed her to show up later as a joke at my expense, and it never did, not once. And slowly, I started to understand that this was what people meant when they said the word safe. She was the first safe place I ever had, and I would have done almost anything to keep her from finding out how bad the place I came from really was. Her family had money, real money, the kind that comes with a country club and a family name that gets buildings named after it. Her father ran a firm. Her mother sat on boards. Her grandmother wore actual pearls, not the fake kind, and she wore them like a warning. They were polite to me in that specific way wealthy families are polite to someone their daughter has dragged in from the outside. This careful distance, this waiting to see whether I'd embarrass them. For 4 years, I had been passing. I had learned which fork, I had learned to soften my accent, I had learned to talk about my family in vague, warm generalities that suggested a normal childhood without ever quite describing one. I built a version of myself that could stand in their world, and it was exhausting, and it was working. When Claire and I decided to get married, her parents insisted on hosting the engagement party at their club, and I remember standing in that ballroom the week before and thinking that I did not belong in a room like that, and that maybe, if I was careful, nobody would notice. I remember thinking that I had almost made it, that I was one good night away from a life on the other side of everything I came from. That is the thought I was having, standing in that empty ballroom, running my hand along the back of a chair, one good night away. I made one mistake. I invited my dad. I have turned that decision over 10,000 times since. I could have not invited him. People do it. People get married without a parent in the room, and the world keeps turning. But he was the only family I had, the only blood in the building. And there is a hunger in a kid like me that never fully dies, no matter how many times it gets starved. This need to have your father see you standing somewhere good, to have him witness you having made it out, as if his witnessing could retroactively make the getting out real. I wanted him to see me in that ballroom. I wanted him to see the fork, and the softened accent, and the woman who reached for my hand instead of a notebook. Some stupid, undead, 8-year-old part of me wanted my dad to be proud, so I invited him. That was the mistake, not the roast, the invitation. invitation. I told myself he'd behave. I told myself he understood what this night was, who these people were, what was riding on it. I even talked to him beforehand, sat him down at his cluttered kitchen table with the comedy notebook stacked everywhere, and told him please, just this once. No bits, no stories, no jokes about me. Just be a normal father for one evening. He put his hand on his heart. He said, when have I ever embarrassed you? He said it with a straight face, and some part of me, the stupid, hopeful part that never fully dies no matter how many times it gets killed, believed him. Ronnie showed up already drunk. He'd clearly had a few at whatever bar he stopped at on the way, and he was wearing a suit jacket with a shiny lapel that caught the light like a disco ball, the kind of thing you wear when you want the room to look at you. He came in loud. He was shaking hands with Claire's father's business partners like they were old friends, telling them he was in entertainment, telling them he'd been in the game for 30 years. He kept interrupting conversations to try out lines. People smiled the way you smile at a man you've just decided to avoid for the rest of the evening. Claire's mother had this look on her face, this careful, frozen politeness. And I knew that look. I'd been getting some version of it from that family for 4 years, and I could feel the night starting to slide. I tried to keep him contained. I stayed near him, refilled his water, tried to steer him toward the exit, toward the bathroom, toward anywhere. But you can't contain a man like Ronnie. Containment is an insult to a man like Ronnie. Halfway through dinner, when the tables had gone quiet in that lull between courses, he stood up and clinked his glass with a fork. He clinked it hard, 3 times, 4, until the whole room turned to look, and he gave everyone that big open mic grin, and my stomach dropped straight through the floor of that beautiful ballroom. Nobody asked him to speak. There was no toast scheduled. Claire's father had a whole program, printed on little cards, and my dad was not on it anywhere. But Ronnie didn't need to be invited. He'd been waiting his whole life for a room this nice to be quiet and pointed at him. He started off okay, is the thing. He said he was proud. He said he never thought this day would come, that he never thought somebody would actually want to marry me, and a few people did a nervous laugh because it sounded like a normal self-deprecating dad joke, the kind everyone tells. And then he said he had a funny story about exactly why he never thought this day would come, and I knew. I knew before he said another word. I felt it the way you feel a stare that isn't there in the dark, that lurch, that fall before the fall. He told them about when I was 19. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on what happened when I was 19, because it isn't a bit, it was the worst period of my life, and I've spent years learning how to hold it without it swallowing me. But the short version is that I fell apart. I fell apart badly. There was a night that ended with my father driving me to a hospital, and there were 72 hours after that where I wasn't allowed to leave, and there was a long climb after that, back to being a person. It was the most private, most fragile thing I own. Only 3 people in the world knew about it. Claire wasn't one of them yet. I was going to tell her. I had a plan for how and when, gentle, in private, when the time was right. My father told 200 people at a country club instead, and he didn't just tell it, he performed it. He did the voice, the whiny cartoon voice, the same one from the bathtub bit and the stutter bit, except now the whiny cartoon voice was saying that it wanted to die. He acted out the crying, screwing his face up, wiping at fake tears with the back of his wrist. He got a laugh line ready about finding me, about the drive across town, about the sliding doors of the hospital, and when the laugh didn't come, he pushed harder, because that's what he always did when a bit was bombing. He pushed, he leaned into the mic, he raised his voice, he tried it a second way. I could see him do the thing I'd watched him do 1,000 times in 1,000 terrible little rooms. That recalibration, that certainty that the joke was fine and the crowd just needed to be worked. He mimicked the beeping of a heart monitor. He made the sound with his mouth, steady, then faster, and a woman near the front put her napkin down very slowly. He actually got down, at a black tie engagement party, in his shiny lapel jacket, and knelt on the polished floor to show the room how I had collapsed that night, how my legs had gone out from under me, and he let himself go loose and slide down against the leg of a table, acting it out. My body, my worst night, using his own body to puppet mine on the floor of a country club, and he was grinning the whole time, up at all of them, waiting for the room to give him the one thing rooms had never once given him in 30 years, which was the feeling that he mattered, and I stood there at the edge of it, and I could not move. I could not make my legs work. I just watched my father kneel on the floor and perform the night I almost died, for a laugh that was never, ever going to come. Nobody laughed. I want that on the record forever. Not one person in that room laughed. Claire's grandmother had her hand pressed flat against her pearls. Claire's mother had tears standing in her eyes and a napkin pressed to her mouth. Claire's father looked like he'd bitten into something rotten. One of the business partners stood up and walked out, just picked up his jacket and left, and my dad watched him go and said into the microphone, "Tough room." And then he delivered the line he'd clearly been building toward the whole time. Something about telling the psychiatrist he felt worthless, and the psychiatrist saying, "At least you're self-aware," and he laughed at his own joke. Alone, into a silence so complete, I could hear the ice settling in 200 glasses. Claire was staring at me, not at him, at me. And I watched something happen behind her eyes that I have never fully recovered from. This reorganization, this sudden rewriting of who she thought I was. 4 years of me. And in 90 seconds, my father handed her a stranger. Ronnie finally noticed the silence, really noticed it. And he did the thing he always did. He said tough crowd and sat back down like he'd killed, like he'd just done the best 7 minutes of his life. He reached for a dinner roll. He was completely fine. He had unloaded the most devastating thing in my life onto the people whose opinion mattered most to me in the highest stakes room I would ever stand in, and he reached for a dinner roll like a man who'd earned his lunch. The party ended almost immediately after that. People made their excuses. The polite murmur of a room emptying out around a disaster. Claire's family left first. Half of them have never really spoken to me since. To this day, there are relatives of hers who look at me like I'm a fault line, like the ground under me could open at any second because the only thing they know about me is what my father acted out on that floor. They think it runs in the family. They saw Ronnie, and they decided the instability was genetic, and there was no speech I could ever give that would unsee it. Claire almost called off the wedding. I don't blame her. I would have been scared of me too if all I had was that. There was a week where she didn't stay at my place, where she went home to her parents, and I sat in my apartment and understood with total clarity that my father had reached across 10 years and across a whole city and taken the one safe place I'd ever built and cracked it down the middle, and that he had done it for a laugh he didn't even get. It took months of couples therapy in a beige office with a box of tissues on every surface, of me explaining the actual truth of what happened when I was 19, slowly, in the right order, in my own words instead of the cartoon voice, of me proving over and over that it was one crisis, a long time ago, a thing I had walked through and survived and built an entire life on the other side of. I had to hand Claire the real version to compete with the version my father had thrown at 200 people, and the real version was quieter and sadder and had no punchline, and I had to trust her with all of it, in a hurry, on my father's timeline instead of mine. That's a thing he took too. He took the gentle, careful way I was going to tell her and replaced it with an emergency. There was a dinner, about a month after, where I sat across from Claire's mother and tried to explain myself, and she listened with her hands folded, and at the end she said one thing. She said, "We just want to be sure this is a family we can marry into." She said it kindly. That was the worst part. She said it kindly, and I understood that my father had, in 90 seconds, undone 4 years of me proving I was safe, and that some rooms would never fully let me back in no matter what I did, because they had seen him on that floor and decided that was the truth about where I came from. And the terrible thing is that they weren't entirely wrong. She stayed. Claire stayed. She's a better person than I am, and she stayed. But something got taken from us that night that I don't think we ever got all the way back. This ease we used to have, and I know exactly who took it. And I know this too. About 6 weeks after the engagement party, I found out from a mutual acquaintance that my father had a brand new bit. He'd taken the engagement party itself, the disaster of it, the room going silent, and turned that into material. He was doing 5 minutes at a bar downtown about the night he bombed at his son's fancy engagement party, about how rich people have no sense of humor, and it was killing, apparently. It was his best new stuff in years. He fed my worst night into the machine, and when that produced a disaster, he fed the disaster into the machine too. There is no bottom to a man like that. Every single thing that happens to him or to you becomes fuel. Even getting caught becomes fuel. My dad never apologized, not once. When I called him, shaking, and asked him how he could do that, he told me I was too sensitive. He told me comedy comes from truth. He told me that story was gold, that a lesser comic would never have had the guts to do it, and that I should be grateful, because now I was memorable. He said that word to me like it was a gift he was handing across the phone. Memorable. He took the worst night of my life and stapled it to the worst night of my engagement and called the whole thing a favor to me. And when I told him he had ruined my relationship, that Claire was gone, that her family would never look at me the same way, he was quiet for a second, and then he said, "That's good. That's real. You should write that down." And I hung up on him and sat on my floor and understood that there was no version of my father coming to save me, that there never had been, that the notebook was always going to be fuller than the fridge. The wedding was 3 months out, and my father, who had detonated my engagement party, assumed without question that he would be giving a speech at the wedding. He assumed it the way he assumed the last of the fridge was his. He started calling me for material. He wanted embarrassing stories about Claire. To balance it out, he said, so it wasn't all about me. He wanted to know if she'd ever done anything stupid, anything drunk, anything he could work with. He bought a white dinner jacket with a sequined lapel that looked, in the photos he sent me, exactly like a groom's jacket, because he said he needed to stand out. He needed to stand out at my wedding. I told him he wasn't giving a speech. I told him plainly, on the phone, no speech, not a toast, not a word into a microphone. He laughed at me. He actually laughed, that open mic laugh. And he said, "You can't stop the father of the groom from talking." And he said it like it was a law of physics, like gravity, like something that simply could not be prevented. And in that laugh, I heard 30 years of him taking whatever he wanted from me and calling it his by right. I set boundaries. I want that on the record too. Before anyone decides I skipped straight to cruelty. I set every boundary a person can set. After the phone call, I sent it to him in writing, in a text, so there could be no confusion, no bit, no misunderstanding to hide behind. No speech, no microphone, no stories about me. If he could not agree to that, he was not coming. He replied with a thumbs up, and then, 40 minutes later, a second text asking whether the venue had a house mic or whether he should bring his own. 2 days later, I found out he'd called the venue directly. He'd gotten the number somehow, called the event coordinator, introduced himself as the father of the groom and a professional entertainer, and asked about sound equipment, about when in the reception timeline would be best for him to grab a few minutes, whether they preferred a wireless mic for someone who liked to move around the room. The coordinator called Claire, confused, because none of this was on any schedule she had. I drove to his apartment that night, with my heart going like a fist on a door. I stood in his living room,